Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the Director of the Institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge we are on the country of the Barramudigal people of the Darug Nation and acknowledge their ancestors who have been traditional owners of their country for tens of thousands of years. And also acknowledge and pay my respect to First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to IAC My China Story series. Today, we are greatly honored and delighted to have Dr. Geoff Raby AO to share some of his stories of nearly 4 decades of work and life connections with China, Chinese people, Chinese culture, Chinese society, Chinese food, Chinese politics. This session featuring Dr. Raby has been long overdue because Geoff has always been so busy with so many things, including writing and completing his latest book, which we will discuss later. Being a China specialist, former ambassador to China, Chinese entrepreneurship expert, and one of the biggest collectors of Chinese contemporary art, Dr. Raby has been very well known in Australian China space in Australia and in China. Today, with limited time, we will try to touch on different aspects of Dr. Raby's wide range of lived experiences in China. You have all read Geoff's short bio in our invitation. So to save our precious time for Geoff's stories, I will skip reading his short bio. The structure of the talk today is Dr. Raby will give a presentation first, followed by my conversation with him. We will then leave some time for questions from the audience. So please post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Geoff to respond at the end of our conversation. Now, please welcome Dr. Geoff Raby AO to give his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jing, for that introduction, and especially for the invitation to appear on your excellent China My Story series. It's great to have people who've had long experience with China coming together in this program to be able to reflect and share their stories, which hopefully will inspire another generation of enthusiasts about engaging with China. My story is one of accident and serendipity. I think a lot of life stories are like that, but I had no China background when I first became engaged with China. I had no Chinese language. I still have very little Chinese language after 4 decades, which is a disgrace, and I'm deeply ashamed by that. But I am a simple economist, and I just was one of these people that was lucky to find himself in the right place at the right time. But I did have some background in the reform of centrally planned economies, which I'd studied at university, and also had traveled in my first travel overseas when I was just a 21-year-old to a number of countries which today don't exist, but were behind the Iron Curtain in those days. And so I saw centrally planned communist countries in Europe behind the Iron Curtain. And I studied subjects in economics at university related to that. So when it came for me to move to Canberra, and I had really thought that I would be an academic, not a public servant or a diplomat, I applied for a job with the Office of National Assessments in 1984. And it was just at that time that Deng Xiaoping had announced the extension of the agricultural reforms, which had started in 1979, that they would be extended to the whole of the Chinese economy. And this was earth-shattering news. Most people didn't believe it. Many people didn't understand what it would mean. But there was one individual who caught on to this and related to it, and that was the Australian Prime Minister at the time, Bob Hawke. And Bob Hawke had a very clear view that the future of China was not to continue as a backward, isolated, marginal country, but China would one day assume its rightful place as a leading nation in the world, as it had been for so long. And it would do this through opening its economy, embracing the market, engaging with the international community. And Hawke understood that if China did even half of what they were saying they were going to do, it would have a profound impact on Australia. And I just happened to be someone that knew a little bit about these things, not much, knew nothing about China, and found myself as the China economic analyst in the Office of National Assessments in September 1984. It's actually 40 years ago next month that I made that change in my career, and that changed my life entirely. So 20 months later, I found myself posted for just 1 year to Beijing as the first ever professional economist appointed to an embassy overseas. And it was just for 1 year that the old Department of Foreign Affairs, which had a very restricted entry system and was a part of the bureaucracy set apart from the rest of the bureaucracy, did not like anyone coming in any other way than from the very bottom and working their way up through the system. I was parachuted in. I went to Beijing as first secretary economic. And for 1 year, I worked with Ross Garnaut, who was the ambassador, who had also been appointed by Bob Hawke. And for those people listening, Ross then was the Prime Minister's senior economic advisor, but the leading architect of the Hawke reforms of the Australian economy. And the Prime Minister had sent Ross to Beijing to really ramp up the bilateral relationship on the economic side. I mean, you should understand that at that time, a posting to Beijing was a boutique posting. Basically, when ambassadors went, once they landed in Beijing, they were seldom heard of again. It wasn't front and center of Australian foreign policy. But things started to change dramatically under Hawke. And I went to help Ross for 1 year establish what he described in his letter appointing me as a professional economic capacity in the embassy. And as things happened in the bureaucracy, 1 year became two. I obviously proved myself useful, and Ross fought hard to keep me on for another year. And then lucky, again, this is the serendipity of my engagement with China. Luckily for me, the Prime Minister decided to restructure the entire public service in Canberra and amalgamated the Department of Foreign Affairs with the Department of Trade to create DFAT. And that was in October 1987. I had just gone back to Canberra at the end of my posting, was promoted to Class 11 level, councillor level in the new Department of DFAT. And believe it or not, in those days, no one wanted to go to Beijing and take up the newly created position of councillor economic in the embassy in Beijing with a whole section. There was like 5 staff appointed to the new section because the trade and foreign policy work was combined into one place now. And I said, just in a casual conversation to staffing people, I'd love to go back. If you can't find anyone, send me. So less than 6 months after returning to Australia, I was back on the plane to Beijing with a newly minted promotion with a staff. I was only a one-person show beforehand. And I had another 3 years of just a remarkable time where I could bear witness on a daily basis to the extraordinary changes that were sweeping through China as a result of that decision Deng Xiaoping made back in September 84 to reform and open the Chinese economy. And it happened that I was there during Tiananmen Square and bore witness to one of these great traumatic political events of the 20th century. And I traveled freely around China and did what I like to do best, and that's to write reports and analyze developments in the Chinese economy. And so that really marked out my engagement with China. And from then on, China never leaves you. You can return to Australia, you could go somewhere else, but China really is in your system once you've been there. And it was such an extraordinary time in my life. And I was lucky to be able to continue that engagement in subsequent periods of my professional development. I came out of Beijing and set up the East Asia Analytical Unit in DFAT, which is a really amazing initiative by Hawke and Gareth Evans to have a think tank inside the Department of Foreign Affairs, which wrote analytical reports, which were all public. And the purpose was to inform the public debate in Australia about the tremendous changes, not only in China, but clearly China was a big part of the story, that was sweeping across Northeast Asia, and to think through and provide policy recommendations on how Australia needed to change to respond. And Australia you have today, one that has open markets, liberal trade, it's a multicultural society. It is going through some ups and downs. We can talk about that later. But basically, it sees its future in Asia, not apart from Asia. That really goes back in many ways to those years. And I was lucky to be a part of that policy development process. And then winding the clock on forward, fast forward, I was fully involved in China's accession to the WTO from the very beginning to the end. I was fortunate enough to be appointed Australia's ambassador to the World Trade Organization when all of that happened. I came back, I took charge of, as Deputy Secretary of Australia's relations with North Asia, but again, China was a very, very big part of that. And it probably wasn't surprising that I ended up being appointed at the beginning of 2007 as Australia's ambassador to China. And obviously, it's a great honor to serve your country in that way. It's a great responsibility. But for me, it was not quite like going home, but I knew so much about China. I had so many friends. And of course, as you mentioned, I had great engagement with the Chinese contemporary art movement. And to come back as ambassador, in a sense, I hit the ground running. And when I went back, I remember on the flight to Beijing, I set myself 4 objectives. I hope I can remember them, but they're based on my previous experience and in no particular order. But one was never waste a minute, because so much goes on in China. It's so dynamic. Never waste a minute, because your appointment, your time there will go in a flash, in a blink of an eye. The second one was to travel to every province in China. And I'm so proud that I achieved that. And I'm still today the only Australian ambassador to have traveled to every province in China. And in fact, I've traveled to most of these provinces many, many times, including on holidays. I used to basically take my leave in China. And the third one was to spend as much time as possible with Chinese people. And there it's important because it sounds obvious, but in the 5 years I was there in the 80s into the early 90s, China was still very restrictive where you could travel. And you had very few relations with local Chinese. And you were held in suspicion. The government was uncomfortable with local Chinese people engaging freely with foreigners. And in fact, there were some years after I left in 91, before I returned. And the thing that surprised me most, and I still remember the feeling of shock, was that by the end of the 90s, Chinese and foreigners were living in the same compounds, living in the same apartment buildings, going to the same hotels, staying in the same hotels. In my 5 years, that was just incomprehensible. But less than a decade later, that was normal. So that's why I said I have to, on this occasion, where it was so difficult before, spend as much time as I can with local Chinese people. And the last thing, which I'm ashamed about, was to improve my Chinese. So my Chinese is better now than it was, but I had expected that I would be a much better Chinese speaker than I am today. So I had 4.5 years. I'm still the longest serving Australian ambassador to China. And that's nothing to do with me. It's because Kevin Rudd couldn't make up his mind who to replace me with. So I ended up spending 4.5 years as ambassador. And then I did something that's unusual. probably hasn't been done by an Australian before. I resigned from DFAT after 27 wonderful years and set up my own consultancy business. And was very lucky that, and obviously that went very well, but I was also very lucky because a number of major Australian companies like Fortescue Metals Group wanted me to be a director on their board and to apply my Chinese knowledge and background and experience to their commercial interests. So I was able to make the transition from an academic, bureaucratic background to a commercial business background very, very quickly. And so I lived on in Beijing for 15 years. And only because of COVID and Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy in 2022 did I leave. Otherwise, Beijing would still be my home. But it was helpful because it forced me to make the decision at some time I had to change the relationship I had with China. So that pretty much brings us up to the present, Han Jing. I hope that's been of some interest.
Wow, amazing. I mean, the story like this one, you just say it off your cuff. I'm sure you have so many interesting stories that you kept saying a few times, like you've been very lucky. I mean, you have been very lucky, but I think it's also has a lot to do with you. As you mentioned, those 4 things that you wanted to do. Spending time with the people. Many people can't do it even if they wanted to. So there are actually lots of your own attributes that have made you seize all these opportunities. I'm sure opportunities come from time to time to people, but not everyone can seize it. And also I can see that China at the time, each time when the opportunity pop up, just suited you so much. It's very mutual in a way. So I have several questions, but I want to ask the first one. You mentioned, before 1984, you actually had a little knowledge of China. And so 1981, when you were joining the Office of National Assessments, became the China economy analyst because you are expert or you are an economist. What did you know anything? Is there anything that you know as a child living in Australia about China?
No, I have no real connection with China before I began at the Office of National Assessment. So, I mean, there are some of the stereotype things that you can imagine in white Australia, the notion that market gardeners in my grandparents' generation were all Chinese. I knew about Chinese gold mining in Ballarat and Bendigo. I grew up in Melbourne, obviously. But I had always liked Chinese takeaway food at those terrible local Australian Chinese restaurants in those days. But really, I had no personal experience or engagement whatsoever.
Because of the white policy, was there anything or no connection with the Chinese? But the first time you went to China, you had no antagonism or anything negative about China. So you sort of are very embracing your first experience.
Well, I think that's just me. I mean, I love people. I'm open-minded. I mean, it's just it's completely foreign notion that I would have an antagonism or feel in any way not open to different people.
Mm.
I mean, in a sense, I'm sort of lucky. I just don't know. Grew up in that way.
Yeah.
My parents were classic Anglo-Saxon Australians, but I guess for me, it's always curiosity and interest. I'm not sure, but when I was 21, I quit uni at second year and spent a year backpacking around Europe, going, as I said, to places that today don't exist because I was always curious and interested.
Yeah, that's absolutely I wanted to unlock, and that does say a lot, the connection that has happened. My next question is you entered China formally, officially in 1980s, and 1980s widely claimed to be the most vibrant, opened up period in contemporary Chinese history. Do you think that experience formed your fundamental perception, understanding of, and a belief in China?
Well, first, I actually don't think the 80s with that open. I think the openness really was the decade I went as ambassador. It was still in the 80s. It was opening, but in the 80s, you could not imagine what China was like 15 years later. Simply, it was just incomprehensible. But I'll tell you a funny story about my very first trip, which we haven't mentioned, and that was in May of 1985. I was only 6 months in the Office of National Assessment. I wasn't really good. Well, I wasn't experienced in bureaucracy, but I discovered I was actually not a bad bureaucrat because although I was young and probably too junior to be sent on a serious trip to China, I was able to manage to lobby and persuade people to send me. So in May 1985 was the very first time I ever set foot in China. I remember waking up in the Great Wall Hotel in Beijing on the Third Ring Road, someone, and looking out the window. And if you looked east or north from there, it was just paddy fields. That was the edge of the city in its entirety. And just down the road was the Russian wedding cake looking agricultural exhibition building. And, I'd been briefed by, then it was called JIO, the Joint Intelligence Organization, now it's DIO, to go to Qingguangdao, the port of Qingguangdao, and try and work out how deep the port was, because Japan was building an electrified rail line from Datung, the center of the coal-producing area of China, to Qingguangdao, and the Japanese had installed automatic coal handling facilities, and we were terrified that China was going to dominate all of our markets in coal in Japan and Korea and Taiwan. It's hilarious when you think about it, because what happened is China's now a huge importer of Australian coal. No one understood how much China would grow and develop. And the Japanese may have been building all of that infrastructure to supply their own markets. The reality is that it all ended up supplying southern Chinese ports with coal, and much more efficient than trying to ship it by railway or truck it by railway. The other thing is I did on that trip, I was sent to Shenzhen, and Shenzhen had just started. In 1984, the government announced a special economic zone. I went over the border from Hong Kong with David Binns, who was first secretary or second secretary in the embassy in Hong Kong, the consulate in Hong Kong. We had to pass through the barbed wire and the checking and everything. Some dodgy Australian had been lined up to take us around Shenzhen for the day. And there was a half-built fun park, and there was a half-built luxury hotel, and rice paddies and mud everywhere. It was May, and it was so unbelievably hot. And when I was there that day, the electricity had been shut off, so there was no air conditioning. And I went to the Hong Kong Standard Chartered Bank, rather, in the middle of a paddy field, and had to walk up 4 flights of stairs and was just wet through with perspiration. So I went back to Canberra and I wrote a study. It was a very big study, which concluded that Shenzhen could never work. It would be a failure. So luckily that wasn't a career-limiting move. Or no one read my study, probably more like it. But obviously we know the story of Shenzhen is very different now.
It is an amazing story. You've been to places many Chinese never been to, and especially at the time.
Yeah.
It's such a telling story about Shenzhen. Yeah, it is so true in the 1980s.
I saw it at the beginning, the very, very beginning.
Yeah, that's so true. Oh, but that's a very good point you've made. It's actually it's 2000 onwards. It's the very opened up. Yeah, it's like 80s are just starting. That's a good point. Yeah. And my next question is China. China, we know, is a huge country, and with the world's largest population just until recently, and the most complex governance systems. And then we know the culture and the regional diversity is just enormous. How did you manage not to be overwhelmed in your journey of learning about China?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, for me, the experience with China was far from being overwhelmed. It just energized me. It just inspired me. Every day I was inspired. I was energized. I was excited. I mean, I'm an old man now, but I'm surprised I don't look as old as I might seem, because the amount of energy I expended in China, because China just never stops. And I loved it, and I embraced it and ran with it. So far from being overwhelmed, it was like surfing a massive wave. And I was really on the crest of the wave, just surfing it and soaking up and being inspired and uplifted by the energy every single day.
It is amazing, even just Chinese history, because when I came to study Australian history and Australian literature, and I just feel like, oh, that's so good. You can see the whole picture. You know, for Chinese, anything, you can't see a whole picture. You only see a period, and even a period, short period. So it is.
But it's that sort of sense of constantly learning is so inspiring
Yeah.
and so exciting. And I don't want to go to it now, but you mentioned my book, thank you. But writing that, I've learned so much more about China than I thought was possible. And that's the fantastic thing about China: its size, it's the length of its continuous history, its minorities, its geopolitical location. It just goes on and on and on. And after 40 years, I am still energized and still surprised. And there are times when there'll be an archaeological find I'll read about in a newspaper or something. And I think, I just can't believe that a civilization could be so vast, so continuous, so long, and generated so much and so many cultural artifacts, not only of extraordinary beauty, exquisite beauty, but in a volume that's almost incomprehensible. So for me, the passion is still there. And I don't describe myself as a China lover, a China enthusiast maybe, but it's that I embrace it because it is just so vast and exciting and rich.
Mm-hmm. I think even put a passion or love aside, your knowledge is enormous about China. So that stands you out, among many people. So this is my next question. You actually mentioned at the beginning, one of your 4 resolutions is to learn Chinese. Your Chinese is actually quite good, even if you don't speak that much, but you are.
哪里你说的不对，我还差点问。
Exactly. Much better than my son, actually. So your understanding of it is actually quite remarkable. And I often feel like, oh, you instantly you get the key part. Anyway, so my next question, it is very much about your kind of secret weapons. And you mentioned the curiosity. Curiosity is one. And what are other things that you gained an exceptional in-depth knowledge of China, about Chinese politics, Chinese society, culture, and people, cities and the regions that you have traveled to? So share some of your secret weapons, like curiosity, some other attributes that enabled you to get to places in terms of knowledge and understanding, which many other people can't, when it comes to other cultures.
Yeah, look, it's just my openness. I think we've really talked about that, the openness, curiosity. I always have a morbid fear of boredom. You'll never be bored for a nanosecond in China. It's absolutely impossible. But to that, what I'll say is, what's very disappointing about the approach many people take to China is that they have preconceptions that colleagues, Western diplomats, with whom I've spent obviously a lot of time, so many bring ideological baggage, and it's such a waste, because if you come with preconceived ideas, with ideological baggage, you're going to miss so much, and you'll just basically confirm all your prejudices. And for whatever reason, I'm lucky not to have any of that. And that's really what has equipped me to engage and embrace with China the way I have.
So well said. It's really good to hear that. And that's exactly what we are we wanting to know. So yes, you have so many interesting historic photos like this one. I really like to take the opportunity to show a couple for you to share with us some
Yep.
behind the picture stories. So for this one, can you tell us when and where it was taken?
Yep. It was taken in April 2008 on Kevin Rudd's first visit to China as Prime Minister. And for those listening, probably most of you know that Kevin Rudd is a very fluent, very capable Mandarin speaker. And he and I worked in the embassy together in 1986. And so it was a tremendous thing when he came back as Prime Minister of Australia. Then the only foreign Western leader, an only Western leader who was fluent in Mandarin. And it was a great thing. And so there's Kevin introducing me to Premier Wen Jiabao in the Great Hall of People. There's a dash of red behind him, which is Teresa, his wife. And the person on my right is Michael L'Estrange, who was Secretary of DFAT at the time. So, as a Prime Minister does, he's introducing his ambassador to the Premier of China.
Did he introduce in Chinese?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He used a lot of Chinese in his visits.
Right, right. Oh, that's so interesting. That is a remarkable historical picture. People may not even realize, you were there when he was prime minister, but
Oh,
you
yes.
were not
Yeah.
appointed by him.
No, I was appointed by John Howard.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
And reflecting the instability in Australian politics at the time, I served three prime ministers, Howard, Rudd, and Gillard, and three foreign ministers.
Right. Did Gillard go to China while you were ambassador?
Yes, towards the end, April 2011.
Right, right.
So 3 years after this, beautiful spring weather, and that was her first visit. And I had about 4 months left in the job at that stage.
Right. Okay, so you served as the Australian ambassador to China, as you mentioned, 2007 to 2011. Now, looking back, almost 13 years ago when you left. So, what were some of the highlights during your 4.5 years of service?
Oh, yeah. So, in a sense, there's many. Sometimes I think every day was a highlight. It was such an exciting period, a great thing to be doing. Clearly, prime ministerial visits, particularly Rudd's first visit as the only Western leader who spoke fluent Mandarin, was a really big thing, and it became a very fraught and difficult visit because the first thing he did when he arrived in Beijing was to come to my residence, work with my interpreter on his speech, which he then went to Beida, Peking University, and gave in Mandarin. But unfortunately, in the speech, he started lecturing the Chinese about human rights and how they should manage Tibet. And he and the famous Australian Chinese scholar, Jeremy Barmay, came up with this notion of Zhengyao, the special friend of China, so special, I can tell you what you do wrong, and you have to thank me for it. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the sense. Well, that went over very, very badly, extremely badly. And it was also badly judged because the speech was given in public to the students before Rudd had even met any of the senior leadership. And it wouldn't have been possible for me to have stopped him doing that, but I do hold myself responsible that I didn't try and prevent him speaking to the students in public like that before he spoke to the senior leadership. So it was a very complex and very difficult visit. On a more positive note, later that year we had the Olympics, and it was a fantastic time to have been in Beijing in the Olympics. It was another world. People couldn't believe that this was China. And we had all of our sports people, and we did very well. And it was great being an ambassador because I went to everything and participated in everything. And in a similar vein, we did in 2010 was the World Exhibition in Shanghai. And although I had no personal contribution to make to the pavilion, we did front a pavilion that all Australians should be proud of, made in rusting steel, so it looked like the Pilbara and iron ore. And it really was a thing of the moment, a thing of the time. I also was ambassador in 2010 when we did the Year of Australian Culture in China, and we brought a lot of Australian Aboriginal Indigenous art to Beijing and had a very, very big exhibition at the Meishuguan, the National Art Gallery. But a lot of the things that were really exciting for me were private things. My time with the artists, my travels. I've been to Tibet many times. I've been to Xinjiang many times. So the private things also were really big highlights for me.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Rudd speech in Peking University as one of the challenge or tricky circumstances. Can you tell us another one that you have to deal with? You know, tricky, challenging, critical circumstances that you had to deal with.
Yeah, well, there were quite a few actually. A lot of them revolved around Prime Minister Rudd at the time. So there was the case in July 2009 when there were the deadly riots in Urumqi in Xinjiang, and Rudd made a statement linking our concern about those riots with our views on China's human rights. Well, the problem was on this occasion, it was Uyghurs killing Han Chinese. And the Chinese government were just ropeable with our comments. And I was called into the foreign ministry almost immediately and dressed down by the vice foreign minister. But it's interesting, Zhang Jijun, the vice minister, was a very good friend of Rudd. And Zhang Jijun also spoke beautiful English. And he spoke to me in Chinese and read his notes and really gave it to me. He then said to his staff, I'll walk the ambassador to his car. He came out by himself with me and said to me as I was getting into the car, why does Kevin, this is in perfect English, why does Kevin say these things? If he's foreign minister, it doesn't matter. But as prime minister, it really matters. But why say it? And so I learned something about Chinese diplomacy, that the words and language matter so much, so much. And so when we got ourselves into that terrible trouble over Foreign Minister Payne and Prime Minister Morrison wanting to have inspection squads going to China during the pandemic, it didn't surprise me that the Chinese reacted so strongly, because that's not how you do diplomacy in Chinese terms. Words really matter. And it's not only what you say, it's who says it and how it says. That was a huge lesson for me, and a very valuable one. And of course, I also went through the whole Stern Hu issue, when Stern Hu was the representative of Rio Tinto in Shanghai. And what I write about in my previous book, China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New World Order, I have a chapter on what I call the Iron Ore Wars. And that whole resource trade period was extraordinary, because the big producers like BHP and Rio did not see the growth that was coming. Suddenly the market snapped tight. The iron ore price went through the roof. Everyone's making money except the Chinese, who are paying huge amounts of money for iron ore. They're extremely unhappy. And then there were issues of bribery and whatever. And the Australian representative of Rio Tinto, ethnic Chinese but Australian, was arrested and put in prison. And then we had to go through the trial and everything. So that was also a very challenging period.
It is amazing the insights you have, the words matters, but with the context that you provided, it just speaks a volume. And that's also actually my next question, which you answered some of it, and which you give a one insights, and perhaps you can share more. So what you learned, or what were the insights that you gained from interacting with the Chinese political leaders?
Well, I think, and this is not an original insight by me, many of my colleague former ambassadors understand this very well, that basically in China, everything is negotiable. Between the countries, everything is negotiable. But more than anything else, face matters. So as long as you protect the face of your counterparty and don't be gratuitously offensive, respect the formalities, and do things privately, then basically everything's up for grabs and almost anything can be achieved. You obviously have to be patient. Things won't happen quickly, but it's a very accessible system once you understand, if you like, the rules. But people get it so wrong because they become impatient or they cause the counterparty to lose face, and say things that are ill-considered, or worse of all, and that's what happened under Morrison government, try and conduct foreign policy through the megaphone, and then you're finished. And the thing is, it's not just the Communist Party, it's not just the officials. Chinese will coalesce against someone who is seemingly rude, gratuitously making you lose face and whatever. You get no sympathy, no support. So the current government has very sensibly buried the rhetoric, buried the megaphone, and I think they are very good, and I really support Foreign Minister Penny Wong on this, in looking after the language, minding how things are done, being very careful about presentation, and of course being very careful about not making Chinese leadership lose face in any way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Now we are looking at the next photo, which you were with Dr. in China. He's always referred to as a Dr. Henry Kissinger. When was this picture taken, and what were you two talking about?
That's a couple of dodgy characters. This was October 2016. I had been given the great honour of being an opening presenter at JP Morgan's global leadership conference. They do this every year. It's a very select group of people. John Howard was there. My session, the opening session, was chaired by Tony Blair. Henry Kissinger was there. This was the function that day after I'd spoken. And it's an important photo for me because that event in many ways led to my last book. I presented my idea that China's grand strategy was based on weakness, not strength, which people find counterintuitive, that Chinese leadership is entirely preoccupied by territorial security, stability of its borders. And, I'm giving it, Susan Rice was there, former Secretary of State, Kissinger was there. I'm giving this view to all these people. And in a sense, it was largely untested up until that time. And Henry responded so positively to it, and thought it was an intriguing way of looking at China, and was so interested in it. We were following the conversation that evening over drinks before dinner, that it inspired me to actually become serious about writing it up as a proper book, putting those ideas on paper and doing it properly. Up until then, I'd given these speeches at the Australian Institute of International Affairs and various places, but I'd never actually had the confidence in my ideas that they would stand up to real scrutiny, even though I was sort of convinced of my view. But I was so touched by Kissinger when he, shook my hand and said, "This is the most interesting way of looking at China." For someone like him, it was a huge encouragement. So that was, October 2016 in Shanghai.
Wow, what a big story behind this picture and the book coming out of it. That
was the last one. Yeah.
It is really amazing. And you mentioned at the end of your term as ambassador, you decided to leave your outstanding diplomatic career. I was really, and to start your own company in Beijing. Was it an easy decision? And what prompted you to take that path?
It was when I made the decision, it was easy. It had been on my mind for a while. There are a couple of events, maybe 3 or 4 months before I made that decision. So I left in August 2011. So it um, would have been like April, I think. I was sailing with my friend Ralph Hillman on Sydney Harbour. Ralph's ex-DFAT guy. And he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, we only got 4 months. I don't know." So I said, "Look, I don't want to go back to Canberra. They haven't offered me anything interesting as another posting yet." Um, I said, "I've got a lot of companies talking to me saying, look, if you're thinking of doing something different, we'd like to have a conversation." And I said, "I just don't know." And Ralph just looked at me. He's a Wollongong boy. He had a great cut through. It still does. He just said, "Look, mate, you only die wondering." And that was basically it. But then a month or so after that, I got a phone call from Paul Keating. And I know Paul well, and particularly in those days, we used to talk a lot. And he rang, and it was just out of the blue. And he said, mate, what are you going to do, mate?" I said, "Oh, well, I'm sort of thinking I might move on. I don't know." He said, "Mate, you've only got one choice. Either go back to Canberra and spend the rest of your life walking around with your ass hanging out of your pants, or you can go and make some money." "I know what I do, mate." And so that was it.
Wow, how interesting. And obviously it was a good decision, right decision.
Oh,
Looking
it's fantastic. Yeah,
at
yeah,
some
yeah,
of
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
mm.
And I wasn't too old. I was just 58, and I had 27 years in DFAT. And as I always say, 27 wonderful years. I never
Mm.
regret a
So
minute of
was it difficult when you first started your company?
Look, yeah, yes and no.
Mm,
Yes, because I'd never done anything like it before in my
mm,
life.
mm,
No, because I had so many great people around me supporting me. I had so much support from business. Uh, I felt like I was on a vertical learning curve for the next 18 months or so. The board directorships was Fortescue Metals Group, Oceana Gold, was a big gold mining company, and then the year after, Yancoal. I'm still on the board of Yancoal. But the directorships, really getting my head around all the corporate governance and all of that. It's like being on I used to say to people, I'm on a vertical learning curve, but the energy and the adrenaline rush was just enormous. And I guess I've explained enough about me as a person that you can imagine that adrenaline rush and interest and new things to do and active and going everywhere, it was just sustained me. It was brilliant. It was wonderful. It sustained me throughout the whole period.
But any frustrations because the system, especially systems in China, there are many parts, could be so frustrating. The way like bureaucracy or so many layers and layers of um,
Yeah,
approval or review and all sorts.
but I love it. That's what gave me work. I was paid to deal with it. I loved it. It was fantastic. The more, the better. Really. Uh, so no. I mean, it was just great. That's the furniture. That's how it is in China. If you don't like it, just leave.
Mm.
But I understood it, and I was paid to help companies navigate through that, and it was a thrill.
Mm. It is amazing. It is a lot of you that make it work. You run with it. And this is the next question, a lot on your personal friendships. And you obviously had this a great time in Beijing. So Sally, can you show this photo so Geoff knows which photo I'm talking about? Yeah. Is this your Beijing Central?
I know Beijing Party Central came later.
Oh, you see.
Beijing Party Central was at Changchangdi.
Oh, see.
This,
And
this is
yeah.
at the Oasis.
All
Well,
right.
uh, the
Yeah.
amazing, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
but so that was my studio party place.
I see.
Yeah.
And you can see almost all great contemporary Chinese artists in Beijing were there. So, and
You,
in
you
yeah, you
can,
made
but you can. But the most important thing about that photo is that, as you know, before I gifted my collection of Chinese art, I prepared a catalogue that Damien Smith, who's in the photo, he curated, and nearly every artist in the catalogue is in that picture. That's what makes it such a remarkable picture.
Indeed, that's my question is you made so many friends with the Chinese people and Chinese artists, even though you said your Chinese is not that good. And many of the Chinese artists, their English is not very good. So language is obviously not a barrier. And friendship is fundamentally about understanding and trust. How did you build that mutual trust?
A lot of Baijiu. White spirits for those listening. Yeah, I mean, look, how can you not? You look at those people. How can you not have a fantastic time? You know, they were so great to me, and you open your heart to each other. It's fantastic.
Mm.
It's not hard.
Well, it's yes and no in a way, because I see with them and the comfort that people have around, when they are with you. It is quite remarkable. It feels like you are Chinese in it. So yeah, it's just really, I think it has a lot to do with who you are and the way you relate to people.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
mm, mm,
But for me, look, China's been very, very, very good to me,
mm.
and that photo captures sort of my life in all those years. And I can't help but say I was just very fortunate.
Yeah, you had a great time in Beijing. And you talked about an art collection, which we mentioned. We had to talk that you had to talk with us for the art talks about your collection,
Yeah.
and you generously donated all your collections to La Trobe University. And we've been to two, collection exhibitions, Bendigo and Sydney. So, apart from Chinese art, yeah, did you have develop any interesting other forms of a Chinese art, such as music or theater or Peking opera?
No, not really. I mean, uh, obviously, because of my limited Chinese, I'm restrained from theatre or comedy, many of those other forms, which are so important. Um, I obviously, if I'm not sure how you're defining art, but shufa, calligraphy, uh, traditional Chinese art, ink art, porcelain. Of course, it's all fantastic. I was very interested in that, but I only ever collected Chinese contemporary art. Um, yes, but I just never warmed to Peking opera. I've been to Peking opera, but never warmed to it.
Yeah.
Chinese classical music I love.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'm sure you've been to many performances of Peking opera.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, that was my curiosity. That's a very good answer. My last question is about your new book, which you have completed, and that is why you are in a very good mood. Completed another book. Amazing, Geoff. So it's called A Great Game On, the contest for Central Asia and global supremacy.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about this book? What's it about and why you write this book?
Yeah, okay. Look, the genesis of the book really was my last book. And what I wanted to do was to explore at greater length and depth uh, this China's sense of security, where it finds its security, how it sets about achieving its security. And for most of Chinese history until very recently, the threats for China have all been from within Eurasia, from the Eurasian landmass. And so you understand, in my view, China's approach to the world much better if you understand that that's where security threats came from. And so much of China has positioned itself historically to defend itself. A Great Wall, obviously, although it was a waste of money, waste of time, but there you go. Uh, but it very much with how it deals with its peripheral territories like Xinjiang and Mongolia and Manchuria. And I was heading down that track, and the starting point for the book is the US NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that leads into the Great Game, of course, which was a 19th century contest between Russia and Britain for influence over Central Asia. But with the US and the NATO forces leaving Afghanistan in August 21, for the first time in hundreds of years, there'd not been a European presence in the Central Asian landmass. And so the contest then was between Russia and China for dominance and influence. And there's an old set of thinking in geostrategy and geopolitics that whoever controls what's called the Eurasian landmass, or the territory of Eurasia, the heartland, whoever controls the heartland will be the dominant global power. But as I started the book, I was thinking in all of these ways, Putin invaded Ukraine. And so it fundamentally changed the contest between Russia and China. It put China in a very dominant position. And then Xi and Putin announced this friendship without limits, which I describe in the book as a concert of convenience, and then developed this idea of what I call the Chasha anxiety, the anxiety in the West that the authoritarian states of China and Russia will unite against the Western powers and try and change the global order to one which is much more accommodating of authoritarian regimes. And I pulled that apart and found myself traveling in a place that I knew very little about, but I was learning all the time. And I really try and explode the myth of Chasha. That's why I call it the Chasha anxiety, and try and explain China's approach to world order and its own security in a different way than you get in the standard media.
Can't wait to read this book. And this new book is to be released by Melbourne University Press in November.
12th of November.
Yeah, so we hope we can have you back to talk about that book in particular. And I love the term Chasha anxiety. Wow, that's a great one. Great one. Geoff, it's so interesting to hear all your insights and the great stories you have. And then there is a lot more. So we can't thank you enough for this wonderful talk and for all your great responses. And Geoff, I'm telling this to you again, you must write your memoir before you leave this world.
Yes.
Your unique and very individual experiences and stories won't be repeated. So thank you, Geoff, again. And thank you all listeners for your interest and for your support to IAC. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Han Jing. Thank you for having me.